The snow fell silently across the Ardennes forest, blanketing the twisted roads and shattered villages in an eerie white glow. It was December 1944, and Europe was gripped by the final, desperate gamble of Adolf Hitler's Third Reich. The German High Command had launched a massive counteroffensive, thrusting through the Ardennes in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Their goal was simple and ruthless: split the Allied forces, seize Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace on their own terms. But as their armored spearheads drove deep into Belgium and Luxembourg, one small town became a fulcrum on which the entire operation threatened to collapse: Bastogne. The town itself was not remarkable in appearance. A cluster of stone houses, narrow streets, and surrounding fields, Bastogne was just another Ardennes town that might have passed without notice in peacetime. But to military planners, it was the heart of a vast road network. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the arteries through which troops, tanks, and supplies would flow. For the Germans, it was a gate that had to be smashed open. For the Allies, it was a gate that could not be lost. Into this crucible marched the men of the U.S. 101st Airborne Division. They were paratroopers, already veterans of Normandy and Holland, battle-hardened, yet weary from months of unrelenting combat. When the German offensive erupted, they were rushed by truck to Bastogne, with little time to prepare and with supplies already running dangerously thin. They arrived in the snow, digging foxholes into the frozen earth, knowing that the storm about to fall upon them would test not only their strength, but their very will to survive. By December 20th, Bastogne was surrounded. German tanks encircled the town, artillery pounded it day and night, and infantry pressed in from every direction. The 101st, along with elements of armor engineers and support troops, found themselves cut off, an island in a sea of enemy forces. There was no way out. Food began to dwindle. Ammunition stock shrank with every firefight. And perhaps worst of all, the skies, normally a promise of Allied dominance, were sealed shut by winter storms. Heavy clouds, snow, and mist prevented any relief by air. The men in Bastogne were alone, with nothing but their rifles, their grit, and each other. The German command knew it. They believed the 101st was finished. On December 22nd, they sent envoys under a white flag into the American lines. They carried a neatly typed letter demanding surrender. The Americans, they argued, were hopelessly outnumbered, surrounded, and doomed to destruction. To resist would only prolong the suffering of their men. But the 101ST's acting commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, responded with a single word that would echo through history: nuts. The rejection stunned the Germans. They had expected at least hesitation, perhaps negotiation. Instead, they were met with defiance. McAuliffe's reply spread quickly among his men, lifting morale even as the siege tightened. But morale alone could not stop hunger, frostbite, or dwindling bullets. Every day, the situation grew more desperate. Medics struggled without bandages. Soldiers wrapped their feet in rags to keep them from freezing. Machine guns had to be rationed for lack of ammunition. If relief did not come soon, no amount of courage would keep Bastogne from falling. And yet, unknown to men below, far above the clouds, hundreds of aircraft waited. The U.S. Army Air Forces had prepared a daring plan. When the weather broke, they would launch a massive resupply mission, dropping food, medicine, ammunition, and fuel directly into Bastogne. It was a plan that carried immense risk. Planes would fly low, vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire, and their precious cargo could scatter across enemy lines. But without it, the defenders of Bastogne had no chance. The tension mounted with every passing hour. Men huddled in their foxholes, staring up at the gray sky, praying for a break in the clouds. They spoke in hushed tones of the promise of resupply, but no one dared believe too strongly. Too many times the weather had betrayed them. Too many times they had been left alone with nothing but the icy wind and the rumble of German guns. Then, on December 23rd, the miracle came. The skies began to clear. Pale shafts of winter sunlight broke through the clouds, and suddenly, the roar of engines filled the air. Heads snapped upward. Eyes widened. From horizon to horizon, wave after wave of American transport planes appeared. Douglas C-47 Skitrans, flying in tight formation, their wings glinting in the cold light. Behind them, Their bellies opened, and streams of parachutes blossomed against the sky. The men of Bastogne watched in awe as supplies rained down upon the town like manna from heaven. The Germans, too, saw it from their positions encircling Bastogne. They watched as 241 American aircraft delivered lifelines into the besieged garrison. They saw crates of food, medicine, and ammunition floating gently to the earth, carried by colorful parachutes. They saw the defenders running out to collect them, cheering, waving their helmets, shouting with joy. And at that moment, the truth became impossible to ignore. The 101st Airborne was not starving. They were not running out of bullets. They were not broken, far from surrendering. They had just been given the strength to hold. For the Germans, the sight was crushing. Their gamble had been to choke Bastogne into submission, to grind the Americans down until their will collapsed. But now they realized the siege had failed. The American paratroopers would endure, and endurance meant that time was slipping away. Time for Patton's Third Army to arrive, time for the German offensive to collapse, time for the tide of war to turn once more against the Reich. The resupply of Bastogne on December 23rd was more than a military operation. It was a psychological earthquake. For the men of the 101st Airborne, it was salvation. For the German commanders, it was a vision of inevitable defeat. And for the wider world, it became one of the defining moments of courage, resilience, and ingenuity in the face of overwhelming odds. Picture the scene on the ground. Snow still covered the foxholes, and wounded men lay shivering under makeshift blankets. Soldiers had been forced to share rations, sometimes eating nothing more than a few hard crackers in a day. Ammunition was counted bullet by bullet, and then, from the skies, came parachutes bursting open, red, green, yellow, white, scattering across the fields. Crates of K-rations, sacks of flour, tins of meat, drums of gasoline, bandages, plasma kits, even boxes of ammunition. Everything the defenders had been praying for came drifting down. The men sprinted across open fields, ignoring sniper fire and shell bursts, desperate to recover the supplies. Some soldiers laughed, others cried. One medic recalled that when he opened the first box of bandages, men cheered as though it were a treasure chest of gold. But to understand the true drama of Bastogne, one must look deeper into the tactics and conditions of both sides. The Germans had thrown some of their best units into the encirclement, including elements of the feared Panzer divisions. Their artillery shelled the town relentlessly, hoping to crush morale and obliterate defenses. The Americans, in turn, fought like cornered wolves. Every street, every farmhouse, every hedgerow became a fortress. Paratroopers who had once dropped behind enemy lines in daring airborne assaults now dug in, defending house by house with intensity born of desperation. What made Bastogne extraordinary was not just the siege itself, but the sheer improbability of survival. The 101st had been rushed to the Ardennes with almost no winter gear. Many men lacked proper coats, gloves, or boots. Frostbite claimed more victims than bullets, and yet they endured. Soldiers wrapped their feet in torn cloth. Helmets were lined with scraps of paper for insulation. When medical supplies ran out, field medics improvised, using torn sheets for bandages, melting snow for water, and treating wounds with the barest of tools. It was survival in its rawest form, a struggle where ingenuity meant the difference between life and death. Even the German soldiers, hardened by years of war, were astonished by the American resistance. Captured enemy reports spoke of the fanatical defense of Bastogne. They had expected a quick collapse, not a stubborn refusal. The resupply mission only deepened the shock. Imagine being a German soldier stationed on the ridges surrounding the town. You have fought through the bitter cold, carried out assaults, endured counterattacks, and suddenly you look skyward and see hundreds of American aircraft dropping lifelines into what was supposed to be a dying garrison. The realization must have been chilling. The Americans were not weakening. They were growing stronger. One particularly fascinating detail is how the resupply missions were coordinated. The U.S. Army Air Forces relied on Pathfinder aircraft to mark drop zones with colored panels and smoke. In some cases, paratroopers lit fires or waved flags to guide the planes. It was an incredibly dangerous task. German anti-aircraft gunners lined the woods and fields, firing at anything that dared approach. Pilots flew low and steady, braving the flak, knowing that one mistake could mean death. Yet, in those critical days, hundreds of flights succeeded, delivering over 850 tons of supplies. It was one of the largest and most daring air supply operations of the war. The impact of those missions went beyond food and ammunition. They became a lifeline for morale. Soldiers felt a renewed sense of connection with the outside world, as though the skies themselves had opened to remind them they were not forgotten. Stories spread quickly. Men joked about finally having cigarettes again. Some treasured small luxuries like chocolate or instant coffee. The sound of aircraft engines overhead became a symbol of hope, proof that the United States had not abandoned them, that reinforcements were on the way. Meanwhile, inside the German high command, frustration mounted. The siege of Bastogne was consuming precious time, men, and ammunition. Hitler's grand offensive had been built on speed. Swift armored thrusts that would reach the Meuse River before the Allies could regroup. But Bastogne was like a stone lodged in the gears. No matter how they tried, they could not crush it. Every day the 101st held out was another day for General George S. Patton's Third Army to wheel northward. And Patton was coming fast. There is another detail that often surprises people. The men of the 101st did not even realize at first that they were considered surrounded. In their minds, they were simply holding their positions as ordered. Only when German envoys came with their surrender demand did many soldiers truly grasp the situation. Surrounded? One paratrooper later joked, "We were just killing Germans in every direction." That spirit of defiance defined the battle. It wasn't arrogance. It was a kind of stubborn, matter-of-fact determination. Of course, the siege was not without tragedy. Casualties mounted every day. Shells crashed into homes and cellars where civilians cowered. Soldiers wrote letters in the dim light of candles, unsure if they would ever be delivered. Some men broke under the strain, their minds collapsing as surely as their bodies. But for every man who faltered, others stood firm, bound by camaraderie and the sheer will to hold the line. For the Germans, the arrival of American supplies was the beginning of the end. They could see the defenders strengthening, not weakening. They could feel the momentum slipping away. And soon, the rumble of tanks to the south would signal that their worst fears were true. Patton was closing in, and Bastogne would not fall. The days following the first resupply were some of the most intense of the entire siege. The Germans, enraged at the Americans' refusal to surrender and desperate to break the stalemate, launched furious assaults. Tanks pushed forward under covering fire. Infantry stormed through the snow, and artillery rained shells upon the frozen town. Yet each attack met the same fate, repelled by exhausted but unyielding paratroopers. The foxholes around Bastogne became killing grounds, where defenders clung to their positions despite the thunder of guns and the cries of the wounded. The Americans were still cold, still hungry, still short of medical supplies. But now they had bullets, and more importantly, they had hope. Every parachute that drifted into Bastogne was a symbol that the outside world had not abandoned them. The soldiers knew that if they could just hold out a little longer, relief was coming, and relief was indeed on the way. To the south, General George S. Patton was driving the Third Army with ferocity that stunned even his own staff. In one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war, Patton pivoted his entire army northward in a matter of days, racing through ice and snow to reach Bastogne. His men marched, fought and froze, determined to smash through the German ring. Patton understood what was at stake. Bastogne was not simply a town. It was a symbol of the Allied will to resist. If it fell, the Germans might regain momentum. If it held, the German offensive would shatter against it. Inside the town, the defenders endured constant shelling. Civilians hid in cellars as entire buildings collapsed above them. Soldiers learned to live with the never-ending crash of artillery. They counted seconds after each whistle, praying the next explosion wouldn't find their foxhole. Supplies continued to come in from the air, but each day of fighting left new scars. Frozen corpses were stacked like firewood. Medics worked in basements overflowing with blood and screams. And yet, still, the 101st refused to give way. Then came December 26th. Snow still clung to the forests and fields, and the Germans were pressing hard. But from the south, the sound of engines grew louder. Tanks, American tanks, broke through the enemy lines. Elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division smashed into German encirclement, linking up with the paratroopers at Bastogne. The siege was broken. The moment was electrifying. Men who had spent days shivering in foxholes climbed out and cheered. Some wept openly, hugging the tank crews who rolled into town. For the Germans, the realization was devastating. Their great gamble had failed. Bastogne had held, and now the tide of battle was turning against them. The dream of splitting the Allied armies was finished. But the story of Bastogne did not end with the relief. The fighting in and around the town continued for weeks as the Germans tried desperately to salvage their offensive. Yet the spell was broken. The 101st had become legend, their stand forever etched into the memory of the war. When journalists later asked why the men never surrendered, paratroopers gave simple answers. Because they had orders to hold, because they trusted each other, because surrender had never even crossed their minds. The psychological impact of Bastogne reached far beyond the battlefield. News of the stand spread quickly through Allied nations. Families at home, terrified by reports of the German offensive, took heart in the story of the surrounded paratroopers who refused to yield. Nuts became more than a defiant word. It was a rallying cry, a symbol of American determination. For the Germans, the failure at Bastogne was a bitter taste of inevitability. The Reich had gambled everything on a winter offensive, and now it was crumbling into retreat. Years later, veterans of the 101st would speak of those days with a mixture of pride and sorrow. They remembered the cold, the hunger, the desperate firefights. They remembered friends lost in the snow, faces forever frozen in memory. But they also remembered the sound of planes overhead, the sight of parachutes blossoming against the sky, and the moment when they knew they would not be abandoned. One veteran described it best. When those supplies came down, we stopped thinking about dying. We started thinking about fighting. And for the German besiegers, that moment was equally unforgettable, though for very different reasons. Imagine standing outside Bastogne, expecting the Americans to collapse any day, only to watch hundreds of parachutes drift gracefully into the town. Each crate that landed was another nail in the coffin of the German offensive. Each cheer from within the town was a reminder that the enemy would never surrender. For those soldiers, Bastogne was the moment when they realized the war was no longer winnable. The legacy of Bastogne is not simply a tale of strategy or tactics. It is a story of human endurance, of ordinary men enduring extraordinary circumstances. It is the story of how a single town, held by surrounded paratroopers, became the turning point of a massive battle. And it is a story of how 241 planes filling the sky with supplies transformed despair into defiance. When the war finally ended months later, and Europe was free of the Nazi grip, many look back at Bastogne as a symbol of the wider struggle. The 101st had shown that even in the darkest winter, even under siege, even when outnumbered and outgunned, the will to resist could change the course of history. And so, in the snowy Ardennes, surrounded by enemies and battered by shells, the men of the 101st Airborne wrote a chapter that still resonates today. A chapter in which the enemy saw salvation fall from the skies and realized the unthinkable truth. The paratroopers of Bastogne would never surrender.